All I did was set up a simple fence between my yard and what little peace of mind I had left, and suddenly, I was labeled a domestic terrorist. The HOA president completely lost it. She claimed my fence was a direct attack on the community spirit and even called 911, like I'd kidnapped a garden gnome or something. Apparently, 6 feet of vertical wood marks the downfall of civilization. It got so absurd I half expected the FBI to show up and start questioning my neighbors. If you've ever been shamed by your HOA for just trying to live your life, you'll know exactly how this feels. Drop a comment with your craziest HOA story or just let me know where you're watching from, because things are about to get downright ridiculous. Let me give you a little background on how this all began. About a year ago, I moved into Willowbrook Estates, convinced I'd finally landed my perfect suburban haven. The houses were all cookie-cutter flawless, the lawns trimmed with surgical precision, and the whole neighborhood radiated a peaceful vibe. What I didn't realize was that peace came with a heavy cost: total submission to Marcia Billings and her iron grip as HOA president. This woman had more control issues than a malfunctioning circuit breaker. She ran the HOA like it was her personal fiefdom. I should have known trouble was coming when she knocked on my door 3 days after I moved in, clipboard in hand, complaining that my patio furniture didn't match the neighborhood's approved aesthetic of wooden chairs instead of the mandatory wicker ones. The real drama kicked off when I decided to build a fence around my backyard. I'm an urban planning researcher, so I know all about property rights, zoning laws, and building codes inside and out. When I applied for my fence permit, I triple-checked every detail. 6-foot cedar privacy fence, perfectly set back from the property lines, meeting every single city regulation. The city gave me the green light without question, and I had all the paperwork to back it up. That fence wasn't just about privacy. My backyard looked straight onto Marcia's house, and she had this weird habit of monitoring everything going on in the neighborhood like she was running a covert surveillance operation. I couldn't even water my plants without feeling like she was watching and judging me. The last straw was when she reported me to the HOA for leaving my garden hose coiled incorrectly after watering my tomatoes. Construction began on a bright Monday morning in late spring. Things were going smoothly until around 10:30. When I heard the sharp click-clack of heels storming toward my yard, I looked up to see Marcia Billings advancing like she was leading a one-woman invasion. She was decked out in one of her signature floral dresses, her face flushed with fury. "Excuse me, Angelina, but what exactly do you think you're doing here?" she demanded. I stood up straight, brushing off the dirt from supervising the post installation, and faced her. "Good morning, Marcia. I am building a fence around my property. I have all the proper permits if you want to see them." This fence wasn't built out of spite. After my divorce, solitude wasn't just a luxury, it was therapy. That yard, that fence, it was the first boundary I'd set for myself in years. But try explaining that to someone who values neighborhood symmetry over mental health. She barely glanced at the permit before launching into her rant. "I don't care what the city says. This fence violates our HOA covenant about maintaining an open, welcoming neighborhood aesthetic. You're ruining the entire character of Willowbrook Estates with this monstrosity." I nervously fiddled with my wedding ring, a habit I'd developed since my divorce 2 years ago, but kept my voice calm. "The fence meets all city regulations and doesn't violate any legally binding HOA rules. I've done my homework." That's when Marcia completely lost it. Her voice shot up so high it probably scared dogs 3 blocks away. "You are absolutely destroying this neighborhood. This fence makes us look like we're living in some kind of prison compound." Neighbors started to notice, curtains twitched, and Marcia seemed to thrive on the audience. Her tirade grew more theatrical by the second. "This is a direct attack on our community values, and I won't stand for it," she declared, spinning on her heel and stomping back toward her house. Loud enough for everyone watching, she muttered about property values and community standards. The rest of the day went by without incident, but I felt eyes on me from windows all around. News travels fast in suburbs, and I knew Marcia had already kicked off her campaign against my fence. My contractor, Pete, a seasoned fence builder with 20 years under his belt, shook his head as he watched Marcia walk away. "Lady, I've seen some neighborhood drama in my time, But that woman's got serious control issues. You better keep track of everything from now on. He wasn't wrong. By evening, a notice was plastered on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. Marcia had written a long, dramatic letter calling my fence a neighborhood disaster and demanding it be taken down. She even included a blurry photo that made my cedar fence look like a ramshackle barricade. I stood there, reading her over-the-top claims about assaults on community values, shaking my head at the madness. The way she described it, my fence wasn't just a minor eyesore, it was a catastrophic threat to neighborhood harmony. Marcia had a real knack for turning a simple privacy fence into a danger to civilization itself. What bothered me the most wasn't just her wild exaggeration, it was how she'd managed to make my completely legal home improvement project sound like an act of vandalism against the entire community. That night, I received a text from Marcia that sent a chill down my spine. "You are going to regret this fence, Angelina. I'm having it inspected tonight, and I guarantee we'll find violations." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering what kind of person threatens a neighbor over a legal fence. As I looked out my kitchen window at the half-built structure, I realized this wasn't about building codes or neighborhood aesthetics anymore. This was about power, control, and one woman's relentless mission to force everyone in Willowbrook Estates to live exactly by her narrow vision of suburban perfection. The next morning, I was woken by the blare of sirens outside. Still half asleep, I threw on a robe and shuffled to the front door, where two weary-looking police officers stood by their squad car. Behind them, Marcia Billings was planted firmly on my sidewalk, decked out in a conservative navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, the uniform of someone who thinks they're the neighborhood's moral police. She practically vibrated with self-righteous fury as she pointed at my fence. "Officers, thank you so much for coming," Marcia cooed in her sweetest, most saccharine tone. "This woman has built an illegal structure that violates multiple city codes and endangers the entire community." The older officer glanced at me with the look of someone who'd seen his fair share of HOA disputes. "Ma'am, we'll need to see the permits for this fence construction." I nodded and fetched my folder of paperwork. "Here are the city permit, the contractor's license, the property survey, and the approved architectural plans." I handed over everything. The officer carefully reviewed the documents while Marcia shifted nervously beside him, looking like she'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror 100 times. After a few minutes, he handed back the papers and turned to Marcia with an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, this fence is fully legal and properly permitted. There are no violations here." Marcia's face went through a whole range of colors as she processed this news. "But it's ruining our neighborhood," she insisted. "Surely something's wrong with it." The younger officer shook his head. "Actually, it's a very well-built fence. Good craftsmanship, proper installation, fully within code." As the police cruiser pulled away, Marcia whipped out her phone and started filming my fence like it was a crime scene. "This is going straight to the HOA Facebook page," she announced. "I hope you're proud of this felony landscaping." The moment the officers left, Marcia's professional act shattered completely. "This isn't over, Angelina," she shouted across my yard. "I'm calling an emergency home meeting tonight, and we're going to deal with this properly." The way she said problem made it clear she wasn't talking about the fence, she meant me. That evening, I walked into the community center expecting a small group of neighbors. Instead, it looked like a zombie apocalypse town hall meeting. Marcia must have spent all day rallying support because nearly every resident of Willowbrook Estates was crammed into the room. She took the front like a general addressing her troops, wielding a gavel with more drama than necessary. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice heavy with false urgency, "we are gathered here tonight to confront a serious threat to our community's integrity and property values." She gestured at me like I was carrying a contagious disease. "Angelina Henderson has constructed a fence that violates the spirit of our neighborhood covenants and threatens the open, welcoming atmosphere that makes Willowbrook Estates special." I scanned the faces of my neighbors, some confused, some curious, a few looking downright embarrassed to be dragged into this nonsense. Marcia then pulled out large posterized photos of my fence, but something felt off. The images showed the fence crooked and poorly built, with gaps between boards and obvious sloppy workmanship. I stood up from the back of the room. "Excuse me, Marcia, But those photos have been altered. If you look closely, you'll see parts have been cut and pasted to make the fence appear defective. A murmur ran through the crowd as people leaned in to inspect the images. Sure enough, there were clear signs of digital tampering. A section shifted and edited to support her false narrative. The discovery sparked uneasy whispers throughout the room, and some neighbors began questioning Marsha's claims. I could see her confidence start to crumble under the scrutiny. But Marsha Billings didn't become HOA president by backing down so easily. Marsha wasn't about to back down. She slammed her gavel hard and declared, regardless of these minor photo discrepancies, the fence still violates our community standards. Then came her coup de grace census. Therefore, I'm imposing an immediate fine of $500 on the Henderson property, with additional daily penalties of $50 until the fence is removed. The room exploded into surprised chatter as neighbors debated whether Marsha even had the authority to slap on those penalties. I felt my hands trembling, and not from fear, but from pure, burning fury at the injustice. $500 was no small sum, and the threat of daily fines could quickly become financially ruinous. I stood up, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. This fine is completely arbitrary and has no legal standing. The fence meets every requirement and violates no enforceable HOA rules. Marsha just smiled that cold, calculating smile of hers. The fine stands. You have 30 days to comply or face additional penalties. I left the meeting feeling like I'd been robbed by my own neighborhood association. As I crossed the parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Jared Manning catching up. Jared was one of the few neighbors I'd actually spoken to since moving in, a former cop-turned-handyman who lived just a few houses down. He wore his usual faded denim jacket and had a weathered face that told stories of seeing plenty of neighborhood drama. "Angelina," he said, his voice carrying that old cop authority, "don't let Queen Marsha get to you. That woman's been pulling power trips on this neighborhood for years." He glanced back toward the community center, where Marsha was still holding court with her loyal supporters. "She tried the same nonsense with me when I wanted to build a workshop in my garage. Made my life miserable for 6 months before I finally fought back." His eyes locked on mine, full of understanding. "Trust me, Marsha's got more skeletons in her closet than a Halloween star. You just have to know where to look." That night, as I walked home, Jared's words echoed in my mind. What skeletons could Marsha possibly be hiding? And more importantly, was I ready to dig them up? The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. A man with a clipboard was inspecting my fence. When I asked what he was doing, he showed me a work order signed by Marsha Billings authorizing a structural integrity assessment of my property. As I watched the stranger measuring and photographing my fence on Marsha's orders, I realized this conflict was escalating far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Marsha wasn't content with fines and public shaming. She was actively hunting for any reason to declare my fence unsafe or non-compliant. The message was clear. This had become personal, and she wasn't going to stop until one of us gave in. By Thursday morning, I'd had enough of playing defense. If Marsha wanted to make my fence a neighborhood war zone, then it was time to fight fire with fire. That's when Bianca Franklin knocked on my door looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Bianca worked at the local coffee shop and had always seemed friendly enough, though I'd noticed her nodding along enthusiastically with everything Marsha said at the home meeting. She stood on my doorstep, wearing her usual jeans and a coffee-stained t-shirt, fidgeting with her phone and avoiding eye contact. "Angelina, I owe you a huge apology," she began, words tumbling out fast. "I've been thinking about that meeting, and what Marsha's doing to you isn't right. I mean, I know I supported her before you, but those fake photos, that's just wrong." She took a deep breath and looked me in the eye for the first time. "I took some pictures yesterday that I think you need to see." Bianca pulled out her phone and showed me a series of images she'd snapped at the local print shop. The photos clearly showed Marsha working with an employee to create enlarged, manipulated versions of my fence photos, complete with digitally added defects and distortions. "I was getting coffee next door when I saw her through the window," Bianca explained. "She was literally pointing at your fence photos on the computer, telling the guy to make it look more crooked and add gaps between the boards. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So I started taking pictures myself. The evidence was damning. Image after image of Marsha actively manufacturing fraudulent evidence to support her case against me. Bianca, this is incredible, I said, feeling the first spark of hope since this nightmare began. Would you be willing to share these with the other neighbors? Bianca looked conflicted, guilt clouding her eyes. I used to admire her, she admitted. She's so organized, so confident. I thought she really cared about the neighborhood. But now I feel like I helped build her little empire of paranoia. I even helped her block that playground project last year, saying it'd bring too much noise and traffic. It was meant for toddlers. The weight of her past complicity was obvious, and I could see she genuinely struggled with supporting Marsha's increasingly authoritarian grip on the community. We spent the next hour crafting a message to the neighborhood group chat, the very one Marsha had ironically set up to organize opposition to my fence. Bianca's photos were attached, along with a clear explanation of how Marsha had fabricated evidence against me. Within minutes of posting, my phone started buzzing non-stop with replies from neighbors. Messages flooded in expressing shock and outrage at Marsha's deception. Neighbors voiced disbelief and anger. Finally, public opinion was starting to turn. Marsha's credibility was crumbling faster than a stale cookie. But Marsha Billings didn't turn her reputation as neighborhood dictator by giving up easily. Less than an hour after our photo reveal, she launched a counterattack through the very same group chat. Her message was a masterclass in manipulation and deflection. It's clear certain troublemakers in our community are resorting to harassment and character assassination to dodge responsibility for their violations. The photos in question were only enhanced for clarity and not altered to deceive. Meanwhile, Angelina Henderson continues to ignore her fines and flout community standards. She followed this up with a video she'd apparently recorded that morning showing my fence, with what looked like graffiti sprayed across several boards. I stared at the video in disbelief, then ran outside to check my fence. Sure enough, there it was. Crude spray paint scrawled across 3 boards, spelling out what looked like a hastily written profanity. But something about the graffiti felt off. The paint was still wet, despite Marsha's video being time-stamped early that morning. The spray pattern looked deliberate, not the random act of vandalism it was meant to appear. And most telling, I'd been home all morning and hadn't heard a thing. Spray painting silently just outside my kitchen window? Impossible. As I studied the vandalism, my blood boiled when I noticed tiny paint droplets on the ground, trailing away from the fence and leading straight toward Marsha's property. This woman hadn't just faked photos, she'd vandalized my fence herself and then filmed it to prove that my presence was causing neighborhood decay. The sheer audacity left me breathless. Just then, Bianca arrived as I was photographing the paint trail on my phone. Oh my God, Angelina, did you see Marsha's video? She's trying to make it look like your fence is attracting vandals and dragging down property values. I showed her the paint droplet trail. Her eyes went wide with shock and understanding. She actually vandalized your property herself? That's not just unethical, that's illegal. For the next 20 minutes, we carefully documented the evidence: wet paint close-ups, the deliberate spray pattern, and the unmistakable trail leading back to Marsha's house. Our impromptu investigation was interrupted when Jared Manning showed up. He'd seen Marsha's video and came over to check on me. Let me guess, he said with a smirk looking at the graffiti. Queen Marsha's claiming your fence is attracting criminals to our pristine neighborhood. When I showed him the paint trail, his amusement faded, replaced by genuine anger. This vindictive witch actually vandalized your property. Angelina, this isn't hoe politics anymore. She's committing real crimes to win her power game. Jared examined the spray paint more closely, his old police instincts kicking in. You know what's really dumb about this? He said. She used the wrong paint brand for random vandalism. This is the exact same brand and color they sell at Henderson's Hardware, owned by Marsha's ex-in-law. She probably bought it yesterday thinking she was being clever. The 3 of us posted our evidence to the group chat: photos of the paint trail, close-ups of the still wet paint, and Jared's professional breakdown of the suspicious vandalism. The neighborhood's response was swift and decisive. Those who'd been unsure were now firmly on my side, outraged by Marsha's escalating lies and criminal actions. Several neighbors shared stories of Marsha's past manipulations and power trips, fueling a growing chorus against her leadership. Even as I felt a surge of vindication from the community's support, I couldn't shake the feeling Marcia wasn't finished. That evening, while I scrubbed spray paint from my fence, I overheard her on the phone in her backyard, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I need you to revoke that permit tomorrow morning," she said. "This woman is making me look like a fool, and I won't stand for it." Friday morning delivered another crisis courtesy of Marcia Billings. She called an emergency neighborhood meeting through our group chat, claiming she had urgent news about permit violations threatening the entire community. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. in the community center, giving me exactly 9 hours to prepare for whatever fresh hell she planned to unleash. Bianca and I spent the morning in my kitchen, surrounded by printed screenshots of our group chat and her photos from the print shop. "We need to go on the offensive," I said, spreading the evidence across my dining table like a detective ready to crack a case. Marcia had been on the defensive ever since those fake photos surfaced, but now she was gearing up for another offensive. "We need to reveal her pattern of deception before she can spin whatever story she's planning," Bianca said with determination. Her experience running a coffee shop seemed to have sharpened her skills in tracking local gossip and drama. "I've been thinking about what Jared mentioned that Marcia might have skeletons in her closet," Bianca said, pulling up something on her phone. I started digging into the HOA financial records that should be accessible to all homeowners. Most are available online, but some of the recent expense reports caught my attention. She showed me a series of budget entries that immediately raised red flags. There were numerous payments to vague-sounding entities like Neighborhood Enhancement Services and Community Standards Consulting, categories so broad they could mean anything, or nothing. As we delved further into the financial documents, a troubling pattern began to take shape. Many of these mysterious payments coincided with times when Marcia had fined different homeowners. It looked suspiciously like she was funneling HOA funds to cover enforcement activities, possibly even the creation of fake photos and other forms of harassment. "This could be huge," I said, a sense of the bigger picture coming together. "If we can prove Marcia has been diverting HOA money for personal vendettas, we've got her." Just then, Jared arrived with his laptop, eyes narrowing as he joined our investigation. "Look at this same stroke pattern across multiple documents. It's not even a convincing Photoshop job." He pulled up several violation notices from the past year, carefully comparing the signatures. "See how the AM in Marcia has this identical little hook at the bottom? She's been copying and pasting the same signature onto dozens of papers, forging her own name to make it seem like she's following proper protocol." Before we could dig any deeper, a knock at the door interrupted us. I opened it to find a city inspector, clipboard in hand, looking apologetic. "Ms. Henderson, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been a complaint filed about possible permit violations regarding your fence. I need to do a reinspection to ensure everything meets city code." My stomach dropped. Marcia had succeeded in casting doubt on my permit. Keeping calm, I invited the inspector to inspect the fence thoroughly. After about 20 minutes, he turned to me, puzzled. "Ms. Henderson, may I ask who made this complaint? Because your fence not only complies with all city regulations, it's actually better built than most I've seen." The complaint lists structural defects, improper setbacks, and poor materials, but none of that holds up. He showed me the official complaint form. There it was, plain as day. Marcia Billings had filed false allegations about my fence. Armed with the inspector's report and the financial evidence, Bianca and I prepared for the confrontation that evening. But there was one last twist. During our research that morning, Bianca had remembered something that could change everything. "Angelina, a few weeks ago, when I was still going along with Marcia's antics, I was at her house helping her prepare flyers for some HOA campaign. She got a phone call and left her phone on speaker by mistake. I overheard the whole conversation. She was clearly talking about manipulating homeowner complaints and forcing people out of the neighborhood." Bianca pulled up a voice recording, nearly 10 minutes long. At the time, I didn't think much of it because I still believed her protecting property values story. But now that I know what she's really like, I understand what I was hearing. She admitted she had recorded part of the call herself because her voice memo app was running while she took notes. We listened together. Marcia's voice was unmistakable, plotting ways to make difficult homeowners uncomfortable enough to move. twisting rules to justify violations. Most damning was her plan to handle my situation, escalating pressure until I gave up and left. That night, the community center was packed, even more so than during Tuesday's emergency meeting. Marcia had clearly rallied her supporters, preparing for what she probably saw as her final win over my fence rebellion. She was dressed in what I'd come to think of as her courtroom power suit, a sharp black blazer over a white blouse, making her look like a prosecutor ready to deliver a verdict. "Fellow homeowners," Marcia began, her voice dripping with self-righteous authority, "tonight we close the chapter on this unfortunate fence dispute." With an air of triumph, Marcia announced, "After a thorough investigation, I have uncovered that Miss Henderson's fence permit was obtained through deceit, and that the structure itself violates several safety regulations." She waved dramatically toward a new set of large photographs, which supposedly revealed multiple defects and code violations. But this time, I was prepared. Before she could continue, I stood and addressed the crowd. "Marcia, before you present those photos, I think it's important for everyone to know that a city inspector examined my fence earlier today. He confirmed it fully complies with all city codes. In fact, he was impressed by the quality of the construction and said your complaint was completely baseless." I held up the inspector's written report, and murmurs of surprise rippled through the audience. Marcia's confident expression wavered for a moment before she regained her composure. "The city inspector clearly didn't look carefully enough," she replied, though her voice had lost some of its previous authority. "These photographs provide clear evidence." "Actually, Marcia," Bianca interrupted, standing and holding up her phone, "before you show more of these fake photos, maybe everyone should hear something else." Without waiting for permission, she played a recording of Marcia's phone conversation. The room instantly fell silent as the neighbors listened to their HOA president's voice, discussing tactics to push homeowners out of the community. The recording landed like a bombshell, and Marcia's face drained of color as she realized her private words were now public. I woke up the next Saturday morning to the sound of splintering wood and immediately knew Marcia had taken things even further than I'd imagined. Looking out my bedroom window, I saw part of my fence smashed to pieces, clearly damaged by a sledgehammer. My beautiful cedar privacy fence, the very symbol of this entire battle, had been deliberately destroyed overnight. Rushing outside in my pajamas and slippers, I found Jared already examining the wreckage, his old police instincts in full gear. "Someone really went to town on this section," he said, pointing to the shattered boards and broken posts. "This wasn't random vandalism. Whoever did this knew exactly how to inflict maximum structural damage while making it look like an accident." The destruction was precise, 3 fence panels completely ruined, but the surrounding sections untouched. It was a calculated message, costly to fix, and a warning to anyone who defied Marcia Billings. Mrs. Lauren, from across the street, a longtime resident in her 90s, came over and gasped, "I've raised 3 kids here, and I've never seen anything this cruel." Shaking her head, she muttered, "That woman's lost her mind." As Jared inspected the debris more closely, he found something that stopped us both cold: a receipt from Henderson's Hardware, dated just last night, showing the purchase of a sledgehammer and work gloves. Though the receipt was marked a cash, it had actually been paid for with a credit card ending in the same 4 digits I'd seen Marcia use at the grocery store last week. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore," I said, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding me. Just then, Bianca peered around the corner, looking frazzled but carrying more evidence. "Angelina, thank God you're okay." I saw the fence damage from my window and came straight over. "But that's not the worst part. I intercepted something this morning that you need to see right away." She handed me a printout that made my blood run cold, an email from someone at City Hall confirming that my fence permit was being administratively revoked, supposedly due to newly discovered compliance issues. But here's where Marcia's arrogance finally backfired. As Bianca and I scrutinized the email, We noticed the sender's address wasn't from an official city domain. It was a personal email belonging to a David Kramer. A quick online search revealed that David Kramer had been fired from the city planning department 6 months ago for accepting bribes. Marcia hadn't just found a corrupt contact, she'd found someone with no authority to revoke anything. She'd been lying about her connections at City Hall all along. As this realization dawned, neighbors who had heard about the fence damage began arriving to check on me. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood chat, and within the hour, nearly a dozen homeowners had gathered in my backyard. They inspected the evidence at the sledgehammer receipt, the fake city email, and the precise nature of the damage, and even some of Marcia's former supporters agreed things had gone too far. "This is outright criminal vandalism," declared Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher from 2 streets over who'd always stayed neutral in neighborhood disputes. Marcia herself appeared at the edge of my property, dressed casually for the weekend but still carrying the same commanding presence she wore at every home meeting. "I heard about the vandalism to your fence, Angelina," she said, her sympathy sounding strained and insincere. "It's awful when random criminals target our peaceful neighborhood. I hope the police catch whoever did this." Her performance left several neighbors silent, but I was ready. "Actually, Marcia, I think we've already identified the culprit," I said, holding up the sledgehammer receipt. "Funny how the receipt for the hammer used to destroy my fence has the same credit card digits you used at the grocery store last week." Her protests fell on deaf ears as more neighbors examined the evidence, sharing their growing doubts about Marcia's recent actions. The tide had turned completely. Everyone could see it, except Marcia herself. Desperate to regain control, she played what she thought was her trump card. "Well, it doesn't matter anyway," she declared with forced confidence. "I've been in contact with City Hall, and Angelina's permit will be revoked tomorrow morning. The fence will come down, damaged or not." That's when Bianca stepped forward, pulling up the fake email from David Kramer on her phone. "You mean this city contact, Marcia? The one who was fired 6 months ago for taking bribes?" Sunday morning arrived feeling like the calm before a storm. News had spread about the fence destruction and Marcia's spectacular meltdown. My phone buzzed non-stop with supportive messages and calls for an emergency HOA election. The movement to remove Marcia from power was gaining momentum fast, and suddenly, I found myself being pushed as the candidate most likely to beat her. The emergency election was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the community center, giving us just 4 hours to prepare our case and rally supporters. At exactly 2 p.m., the community center was packed with nearly every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Many neighbors carried printed copies of the evidence we'd been sharing in the group chat. Marcia was already at the front, dressed in her most authoritative business suit and flanked by the few supporters she had left. The meeting opened with a formal presentation exposing the case against Marcia's leadership. The fake photos, the financial irregularities, the recorded phone call, the sledgehammer receipt, and the forged city email. Each piece was laid out carefully, building an overwhelming case of corruption and abuse of power that even her supporters found hard to ignore. When it was Marcia's turn to defend herself, she launched into what could only be described as a desperate theatrical performance. "Everything I've done," she declared, her voice rising and cracking, "has been to protect and improve this community." I stood at the front, holding up a manila folder. "These aren't just mistakes, they're targeted attacks disguised as policy." I showed a blown-up photo of the fake graffiti, then the receipt, then the audio transcript. "How many more lies do we have to document before we ask her to leave?" Her most shocking moment came when she produced what she claimed was proof of her innocence. "I've been in contact with legitimate city officials," she announced, holding up another official-looking document. "Angelina's fence permit will be officially revoked tomorrow. This controversy will end when her illegal fence is removed." The room buzzed with concerned murmurs until Bianca stood up, phone in hand, already recording. "Actually, Marcia," she said, "would you like to explain why your legitimate city official is calling you right now?" Bianca showed the incoming call display, perfectly timed. Marcia's face turned ghostly pale as she realized her fake city contact was calling right in the middle of her presentation, completely undercutting her claims of legitimacy. The real bombshell came when Bianca answered the call on speakerphone. David Kramer's voice filled the room, "Marcia, I need that final payment we discussed, or I can't send you any more fake city documents. The Henderson fence situation is getting too much attention, and I'm worried about getting caught." The election itself felt almost anticlimactic after Marcia's dramatic self-destruction. When the votes were tallied, I had won by a landslide, 43 votes to Marcia's 7, with 2 abstentions. Many neighbors who'd supported her throughout the fence controversy had finally seen enough evidence of corruption to change their minds. Several even approached me afterward to apologize for backing her harassment campaign. But Marcia Billings wasn't going down without one last dramatic moment. As the meeting wrapped and neighbors began to leave, she stood and delivered what sounded like a supervillain's farewell speech. "You'll regret this decision," she warned, pointing at the crowd that had just voted her out. Storming toward the exit, she paused for one final parting shot. "This isn't over, Angelina. You may have won this battle, but the war is far from finished. I'll be watching, and the moment you slip up, I'll make sure this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of person they've elected." With that ominous threat hanging in the air, she disappeared through the door, leaving behind a room full of neighbors unsure whether to laugh or call the police. The week following my election as HOA president felt like stepping into an alternate universe where neighborhood politics actually made sense. My first official act was to formally rescind all of Marcia's arbitrary fines, including the $500 penalty she'd slapped on my fence. The satisfaction of stamping void across that ridiculous citation was greater than I expected. Several neighbors who'd been hit with similar penalties over the years lined up to have their cases reviewed. Jared volunteered to help me go through it. Jared took on the task of scrutinizing the HOA's financial records with a fine-tooth comb, and what we uncovered was far worse than we'd feared. Marcia had been systematically misappropriating association funds for years, paying for everything from her personal landscaping to what looked suspiciously like a weekend spa retreat she'd labeled as a community leadership conference. The total amount she diverted was over $3,000. Explaining how she'd managed to maintain her lifestyle despite being unemployed since her divorce. The damaged section of my fence was repaired by a contractor the HOA voted to pay for, since the destruction had happened during official association buzziness, albeit illegal business conducted by our former president. The new boards didn't quite match the weathering of the original fence, creating a visible reminder of the battle fought over my right to privacy. Somehow, those mismatched boards made the fence even more meaningful to me, like scars proving I'd survived something tough. 3 weeks into my presidency, I was enjoying a peaceful Saturday morning coffee on my back patio when something made my blood run cold. Carved into one of the new fence boards, hidden so it would only be visible from my side, were the words "See you soon," scratched deep into the cedar. The message was fresh, probably made during the night, carrying an unmistakable tone of threat and a promise of future conflict. I called Jared and Bianca immediately. Within 20 minutes, they were both at my house, examining the carved message with expressions of concern and anger. But when we tried to track down Marcia to confront her about the vandalism, we found that she'd apparently vanished from the neighborhood entirely. Her house was empty, with a for sale sign in the yard and all the curtains drawn. According to the real estate listing, the property had been put on the market just days after the election, suggesting Marcia had planned her exit strategy well before her final defeat. That evening, I hosted the first neighborhood barbecue Willowbrook Estates had seen in years. The idea came from several residents who wanted to celebrate the end of Marcia's oppressive reign and rebuild the community spirit lost during her time in power. Nearly every homeowner showed up, bringing food, drinks, and stories about their experiences with HOA politics, from hilarious to horrifying to Angelina's fence saga. Jared raised his beer bottle in a toast to the wooden barrier that saved our neighborhood from tyranny. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening air. As the party wound down and neighbors started heading home, me promising to organize more gatherings, I found myself standing alone in my backyard, gazing at my fence bathed in golden sunset light. The mismatched boards told the story of everything we'd endured, and the carved thread reminded me that some battles leave permanent scars. But the fence was still standing, my property was still private, and my neighbors no longer lived in fear of arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. Bianca appeared beside me, carrying 2 leftover pieces of pie and wearing the satisfied look of someone who'd helped right a serious wrong. "Do you think she'll really come back?" Bianca asked, glancing toward the carved threat. I considered the question as I finished my pie, thinking about Marcia's parting words and the pattern of escalating behavior throughout our conflict. "Honestly, I think she's too proud to just let this go," I said. "Somewhere out there, she's probably planning her comeback and plotting revenge on everyone who stood up to her." Just then, as if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Enjoying your victory, Angelina. Don't get too comfortable. Every queen needs her kingdom, and I'll be back to reclaim mine." The fence was just the beginning. I showed the message to Bianca, who immediately started taking screenshots for evidence. But instead of feeling intimidated by Marcia's threats, I smiled, looking at my fence standing strong in the gathering darkness. "Let her come back," I said, surprised by the confidence in my voice. "We beat her once when we were unprepared and disorganized. Now we know exactly who she is and what she's capable of." I used to think fences were just to keep things out, but now, I believe they're about keeping peace, privacy, and identity. A line drawn not in anger, but in healing. That fence was never about defiance, it was about refusing to disappear. As Bianca headed home and I prepared to go inside, I took one last look at my fence, a battle-scarred but victorious, a monument to the idea that sometimes, you have to fight for your right to privacy and peace. The carved threat was still there, promising future conflict, but it no longer frightened me. Marcia had taught me something valuable through this war over the fence. Bullies only have as much power as people allow them. Once you refuse to be intimidated, they become nothing more than angry voices making empty threats. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as HOA president, and maybe someday Marcia would make good on her promise to return. But tonight, I was going to sleep peacefully in my own home, protected by my own fence and surrounded by neighbors who'd proven they were willing to stand up for what's right. Comments always make my day, so let me know, have you ever dealt with an HOA Karen who made your life miserable? What would you have done differently in my situation? And most importantly, do you think Marcia will actually follow through on her threats to come back? Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. Ya stories, thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust me, you'll be hooked.